Good morning from the Freedom of Information and Privacy Association. I'm Patrick Farnsworth, and this is your Access and Privacy Online News Summary for Saturday, June 6th. This week, we begin in Alberta, where new FIPA-Ipsos polling shows strong public support for enforceable privacy rules after the exposure of voter information for 2.9 million Albertans. We'll also look at Alberta's new combined ID cards, the federal lawful access bill, connected vehicle data, and several access to information stories that show how public records continue to shape accountability across the country. And before we go, we'll turn to whistleblowing. From BC's first Securities Whistleblower Award to an Ontario court ruling on undercover investigations. Let's dive in. We begin with the Alberta voter data breach, and new polling that shows Albertans want stronger safeguards for voter information held and used by political parties. A new Ipsos poll conducted on behalf of FIPA surveyed 801 Alberta adults between May 22nd and the 26th, roughly 2 weeks after Elections Alberta disclosed concerns about the alleged unauthorized use and distribution of the provincial list of electors. That list includes the personal information of about 2.9 million Albertans. The results are clear. 84% of Albertans agree that political parties, candidates, campaign organizations, and their agents should be subject to the same private sector privacy laws that apply to other organizations compared to the 9% who disagree. Another 83% agree political actors should comply with privacy law based on fair information principles, rather than relying on party-drafted privacy policies. And 68% support a legal duty to protect voter information against unauthorized access, sharing, copying, or misuse. The poll also shows a strong rejection of political party self-regulation. When asked what oversight should apply if voter information is breached, misused, or shared without authorization, the leading response, chosen by 48% of Albertans, was shared oversight by elections agencies and privacy commissioners with authority to investigate, order corrective action, and refer serious cases for penalties. The next most preferred approach, chosen by only 20% of Albertans, is one where, quote, elections agencies should be solely responsible for overseeing political parties and campaign organizations' use of voter information because the information is connected to elections, end quote. Only 10% preferred political parties and campaign organizations investigating and resolving these matters themselves under their own published privacy policies. And only 5% preferred no external oversight because political parties need to communicate with voters. The poll renewed calls from Alberta Information and Privacy Commissioner Diane McLeod that political parties be brought under Alberta's Personal Information Protection Act. Commissioner McLeod described the exposure as, quote, the worst breach in Canadian history involving voter data, end quote. And she said her office has received nearly 400 messages from Albertans, including people worried about their safety, their families, and the loss of trust in political organizations. The OIPC has also received hundreds of emails and phone calls from Albertans over the last month about the list of electors breach, expressing their need to trust that their personal information won't be leaked. FIPA, along with a growing list of 15 organizations and experts, are calling on Premier Danielle Smith and her government to close this gap. An open letter asks Alberta to bring provincial political parties under PIPA, give the Information and Privacy Commissioner clear authority to investigate and enforce privacy rules, and introduce reforms during the current sitting of the Legislative Assembly. Without these regulations, political parties in Alberta can collect and use your sensitive personal information without being subject to the same privacy rules, independent oversight, or accountability measures that apply to other organizations. People can learn more and sign the letter at voterprivacy.ca/AB. That is voterprivacy.ca/AB. As we've been highlighting for years, this issue is not limited to Alberta. FIPA and partners are also encouraging listeners to sign House of Commons petition E7237, which calls on Parliament to oppose or repeal measures that exempt federal political parties from privacy obligations and to require enforceable privacy rules based on widely accepted Canadian fair information principles. The Alberta breach is a provincial warning with national consequences. Voter privacy cannot depend on political parties policing themselves. Privacy protection must follow voter information wherever it goes. Turning to Canadian privacy stories, we stay in Alberta, where the UCP government is moving ahead with new 3-in-1 identification cards. The Canadian press reports that, starting July 2nd, new Alberta driver's licenses and ID cards will include personal health numbers and citizenship markers. The government says the change will replace paper health cards and make access to services easier. Continuing to echo Trumpian cues, an oil pump jack replaces the driver's license image of a dinosaur fossil, and the words, "Alberta strong and free," mark the back. The addition of health numbers and citizenship status, shown by a maple leaf with CAN or CAN on the card, has raised privacy and discrimination concerns. Alberta Privacy Commissioner previously warned that putting personal health numbers on driver's licenses could increase fraud risk, because health numbers are valuable to identity thieves and can be used to access medical care. Opposition critics have also questioned the citizenship marker, warning that the absence of the marker could create risks of discrimination or unequal treatment. The government says the new cards will have more than 50 security features, and that the change is about convenience for Albertans when they're applying for benefits, not politics. But the timing is notable. The rollout comes ahead of an October referendum that includes questions about immigration, access to services, holding a future vote on Alberta separating from Canada, and proof of citizenship for provincial voting. LGI reporter David Bowles at the St. Albert Gazette also covered the ID changes, noting that the United Conservative government will include proof of citizenship and Alberta healthcare numbers on driver's licenses. Bowles reports that Commissioner Diane McLeod warned in December that the agency responsible for driver's licenses was not subject to privacy laws in the same way, even though it would hold highly sensitive health information for Albertans, and that she has no oversight. That makes the privacy question larger than the card itself. Meanwhile, in Ottawa, privacy concerns continue around the federal government's lawful access bill. The Canadian press reports that Public Safety Minister Gary Anandansangari has rejected calls to shorten the period that electronic service providers could be required to retain metadata. The bill would allow regulations requiring providers to retain digital traces of communications, not message content, but information about who communicated when and where, for up to 1 year. Critics of the provision say the measure would allow for the capture of private information about ordinary Canadians who have no connection to any crime. University of Ottawa law professor Michael Geist told MPs that this could amount to a comprehensive surveillance map of Canadians. He suggested either removing the provisions or limiting retention to 30 days. Anandansangari says the government will hold to the 1-year period, citing investigative needs for authorities, though he has said the government is open to clarifying or strengthening other parts of the bill. And that debate intensified this week. The government is expected to introduce targeted changes to the proposed legislation when MPs begin going through it, clause by clause, in the coming days. The Canadian press also reports that MPs heard sharp criticism from privacy and civil liberties advocates. Signal's Vice President for Strategy and Global Affairs told the committee that if Signal is ever forced to choose between betraying users and leaving a market, it will leave. Apple, Meta, Signal, and NordVPN have all raised concerns that the legislation could weaken encryption or require surveillance capabilities. ICLMG National Coordinator Tim McSorley, representing the Center for Free Expression, said the bill poses a serious and unacceptable risk, calling it the latest in a long string of proposals to undermine Canadians' right to privacy in the name of fighting crime and protecting national security. The government says the bill is not intended to breach encryption and says amendments will clarify that point. But for privacy advocates, the central issue remains. Metadata can reveal intimate patterns of life, even when message content is not collected. Shifting to artificial intelligence, the Canadian press reports that the federal government's new AI strategy will emphasize trust. Artificial Intelligence Minister Evan Solomon says the strategy will include work on privacy, online safety, sovereign compute infrastructure, support for Canadian AI companies, international coordination, and training. Solomon said upcoming privacy and online harms legislation will be part of building that trust he says is vital. But critics say the government is still moving too slowly. NDP parliamentary leader Don Davies warned that AI is advancing faster than Parliament's guardrails and said the technology should be a top priority for both Parliament and government. The key issue is familiar: innovation without trust does not scale. CBC News even reported on a draft copy of the strategy, which includes an initiative to provide all Canadians with free AI literacy training and sets out to increase adoption of AI by businesses. If Canadians are expected to adopt AI tools in public services, workplaces, and daily life, they need to know how their data is protected, how decisions are made, and who is accountable when systems cause harm. And in Alberta municipal government, LGI reporter Chris Zwick at Town and Country News reports that Beaver Lodge, Wembley, and Sexsmith are working together to comply with Alberta's new privacy legislation. Alberta replaced its Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act with two new laws: the Access to Information Act and the Protection of Privacy Act. This was done after the government repealed the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act in June last year. The new privacy law requires public bodies to create privacy management programs and be able to show what records exist, where sensitive information is stored, who has access, how long it is retained, and how it is securely disposed of. Public bodies like municipalities and school boards were given a year to prepare for the new rules for handling public requests for information and how information is classified, managed, and stored. For smaller municipalities, that is a major administrative lift. The three towns are hiring a consultant together to share costs and develop consistent practices. It is a reminder that privacy law reform does not end when a bill passes. Implementation capacity matters, especially for smaller public bodies that still carry the same obligation to protect personal information. And in Thunder Bay, LJ reporter Carrie Ivardi at NWONewsWatch.com reports from the coroner's inquest into the death of Kevin Mamakwa, a 27-year-old man from Kingfisher Lake First Nation, who died in custody at the Thunder Bay District Jail. Nishnawbe Oski Nation Deputy Grand Chief Anna Betty Achni-Peneshkam told the inquest that more culturally appropriate mental health services are needed for First Nations people in custody. She said supports should include better alert systems for high-risk inmates, as well as spiritual and physical supports. Achni-Peneshkam also said consistent and adequate services and resources for mental health to confront the opiate pandemic are needed while also addressing the overrepresentation of First Nations people in correctional institutions. The inquest also heard about the Offender Tracking Information System, known as OTIS, which records personal information, court dates, physical identifiers, and alerts about health and safety risks. The OTIS also has alerts to document whether a person has allergies, if they have past attempts of suicide, if they have physical health concerns, an escape from custody risk, a behavioral risk, attempts at assaulting officer, and if there's a non-association or a non-communication order. That testimony connects privacy, records management, and human safety. In institutional settings, information systems are not just administrative tools. They can determine whether urgent risks are seen, shared, and acted on. Turning now to other substantive national access and privacy stories. The Canadian press reports that an internal Public Safety Canada memo warns connected vehicle data can have intelligence value to adversaries. The memo, obtained through the Access to Information Act, says connected vehicles collect significant amounts of data, and that unauthorized access could be used to establish patterns of life or conduct surveillance on sensitive sites. The document was prepared amid concerns about Chinese-made electric vehicles. Earlier this year, Canada pledged to reduce its 100% tariff on Chinese made electric vehicles to 6.1%, with an annual cap of 49,000 vehicles, in exchange for lower tariffs on Canadian agricultural products. The document warns that the risk increases when Canadian data is sent to or passes through foreign jurisdictions, with more permissive data management rules or where national security laws can compel manufacturers or suppliers to share data. It has been identified that national security laws of certain countries, like China, can compel manufacturers and suppliers to share data with their home government or police. The memo also points to broader risks around smart devices, phones, cameras, drones, cloud infrastructure, and artificial intelligence. The takeaway is not that one category of vehicle is the only problem. It is that connected infrastructure is becoming an intelligent infrastructure. The Access to Information release gives the public a window into how the federal government is thinking about economic policy, privacy, cybersecurity, and national security altogether. In the Northwest Territories, LGI reporter Cody Farron at the Yellow Knifer reports that a public survey on the territory's Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act, the ATIP, revealed serious concerns, but from a small pool of respondents. The ATIP Act is in part intended to allow NWT citizens to access and correct their own personal information held by GNWT departments and other public bodies. The GNWT review included questionnaires, interviews, and an online survey. According to the GNWT, 24 pre interview questionnaires were completed, 18 online interviews were conducted, and 64 residents of the NWT responded to the online survey. Only 14 of the online survey respondents said they had made an access request since August 2021. Among those who had used the system, several reported delays, unclear feedback, and dissatisfaction with the process. 12 of the 14 respondents were either dissatisfied or strongly dissatisfied overall when responding regarding overall satisfaction with the ATIP process. The government says the review will help shape new ATIP legislation and program policies. But the story also points to a familiar challenge in access reform. The people with the most direct experience of the system may be few in number, but their experiences often reveal where the process is failing. The question for reform is whether governments treat that feedback as a warning sign or as a small sample to be minimized. Meanwhile, the Narwhal's reporting, available through the Canadian press, shows how access to information records can expose the pressure industry brings to climate and housing policy. Documents obtained by the Narwhal show natural gas companies lobbied against federal building code guidelines that limit the volume of natural gases that can be emitted by a building. These limits are called Operational Greenhouse Gas Emissions Provisions. The National Code, published in December 2025, includes operational greenhouse gas provisions, meaning builders must consider whether heating, cooling, and cooking systems push a building beyond emissions thresholds. The Canadian Gas Association argued the rules could effectively ban natural gas, increase costs, and favor electrification. Natural gas, a fossil fuel mostly made up of the greenhouse gas methane, represents almost half the energy used in residential buildings in Canada and almost two-thirds of their carbon pollution. The documents show officials were aware of those concerns and were working to address them. The policy stakes are significant. The code is not automatically enforced across Canada. Provinces decide what to adopt, but access records show how industry arguments about affordability, housing supply, energy choice, and emissions are being brought into the policy process. Without access to information law, much of that lobbying context would remain invisible. Now in Ontario, the Canadian press reports that Ottawa has endorsed a plan to move Canada's last remaining captive whales from marine land to aquariums in the United States and Spain. The Department of Fisheries and Oceans has issued the first round of CITES permits, CITES permits, with more permits expected closer to the move. There are 30 belugas and 4 dolphins at Marineland. These animals still face mass euthanasia should the deal fall through. The story also notes that 20 whales, 19 belugas, and one orca have died at marine land since 2019, according to provincial government data obtained through Freedom of Information laws and official statements. On the reverse side of things, the plan obtained by the Canadian press lays out a complex move believed to be unprecedented in scale. This is another example of access records shaping public understanding. In a story about animal welfare, regulatory permits, and cross border movement, FOI helps establish the record of what has happened, not just what institutions say publicly. Now to a broader collection of provincial stories informed by access. The Canadian press reports that Hydro-Quebec fought to hide parts of 1960s correspondence showing what it offered to a French aluminum company, including internal comments about the Churchill Falls energy deal with Newfoundland and Labrador. The revelations that Hydro-Quebec and government officials discussed Churchill Falls with industry in the 1960s are coming to light as the provinces try to negotiate a new agreement to replace the contract, which is set to expire in 2041. The documents were sought through Quebec's Access to Information system. Hydro-Quebec argued that releasing the decades-old records could harm present-day negotiations over Churchill Falls in Newfoundland and Labrador. Quebec's Access Commission disagreed, and the utility released the material. The records show officials discussing how possible Churchill Falls power could affect Quebec's pitch to Pyrénées, an aluminum company considered a smelter in Sept-Îles. At the time, the company was also considering building in the United States. Experts shown the documents by the Canadian press could not identify anything that appeared to give either province an unfair advantage today. They pointed to legislation that says Quebec's Executive Council can only keep certain documents secret for 25 years. One access to information expert said the case shows how easy it remains for public bodies to censor historical information, even when statutory secrecy periods have long expired. That is the larger transparency point. Access delays and redactions do not only affect current policy debates, they also shape how the public understands history, especially when that history still affects interprovincial negotiations today. In Ontario, the Canadian press reports that Premier Doug Ford's government has released blue license plate records it had initially gone to courts to keep secret. Opposing parties have said the information is not sensitive, its release would harm no one, and there is no legitimate reason to withhold it. Ontario's Information and Privacy Commissioner ordered the records released after a Freedom of Information request from the Canadian press. The government first asked the courts to overturn that order, then backed down days later. This short-lived transparency court case follows another in which Ford has been fighting the IPC-ordered release of his phone records. The records showed options for getting the hard-to-read blue license plates off the road, with estimated costs between about $2 million and $2.5 million. The government ultimately chose a zero-cost option, letting the plates disappear through attrition. Opposition critics say the case reflects a broader secrecy by default approach, especially after Ontario changed Freedom of Information laws to exempt all records of the Premier, cabinet ministers, and their staff from access requests. The blue plate issue itself may be old, but the accountability issue is current. When governments fight routine disclosure, the public is left asking what principle is really being defended. In Markham, LJ reporter Scarlett Liu at the Markham Economist and Sun reports that a new sport court beside Franklin Carmichael Park has become a dispute over consultation, transparency, noise, traffic, and privacy. Nearby residents say they are not opposed to park improvements, but they are concerned about a year-round multi-use court operating from 6 a.m. to 11 p.m. within about 20 to 30 meters of nearby homes. Residents say they raised objections during a 2022 community meeting, then heard little until construction was about to begin. Residents said they later received notices in late 2025 advising construction would begin within days. They also say they submitted petitions and requests for noise and parking studies and asked to address council directly. The city says the park serves the broader community, that feedback is weighed equally, and that design changes were made to address resident concerns. The access angle is important. Residents point to documents obtained through Freedom of Information that they say raise questions about how support for the project was represented. The documents allegedly showed a community support letter signed by only 3 individuals that was then used as part of the project approval process. The city of Markham said the project dates back to 2021 when it applied for funding through the Canadian Healthy Communities Initiative following public requests supporting a permanent ice rink structure with year round recreational use. Local land use decisions may appear small compared with national policy, but for residents, transparency and consultation is often where trust in government is built or lost. In St. Catharines, LGI reporter Ed Smith at The Pointer reports that a private laboratory has confirmed asbestos in soil at the former General Motors site on Ontario Street. The sample found chrysotile asbestos at 0.5%, a threshold that can trigger strict handling requirements under Ontario occupational health regulations. The concentration recorded in the sample showed that for every 100 grams of dry soil, 0.5 grams are asbestos, or 0.5%. Environmental experts note that a 0.5% asbestos concentration is a concern. The finding came hours after residents and advocates appeared at Queen's Park to press for provincial action on contamination at the site. The Pointer reports that this is the first publicly documented laboratory confirmation of asbestos in soil at the former GM property, which has been the subject of environmental concern for years. The story builds on earlier reporting based on a more than 2-year Freedom of Information investigation, which revealed environmental testing reports showing serious contamination at the site. Residents and advocates are now calling for stronger oversight and full remediation. This is a clear example of why access to information records matter. Demolition activity is not permitted where asbestos containing material may be disturbed unless it has been properly removed or managed in accordance with provincial standards. Without disclosure, contamination can remain treated as a technical or private matter. With disclosure, communities can press for accountability, remediation, and public health protection. In Saskatchewan, LJ reporter Nicole Goldsworthy at sasktoday.ca reports that Humboldt councillor Marilyn Scott publicly questioned the city manager after she said she and another councillor were intentionally excluded from an email sent to the rest of the council. The email related to a matter scheduled for discussion at a council meeting. Scott argued that excluding elected councillors from information raised concerns about fairness, transparency, and equal access to the information needed to vote. Scott said the email was sent to the mayor and the other councillors, but excluded herself and Karen Siermacheski. City Manager Joe Day said administration would review the matter as part of a coming notice of motion on council procedures and said he did not believe there had been a violation. Scott argued the exclusion raised concerns about fairness and transparency under Saskatchewan's Cities Act. The exchange points to a core governance issue. Access to information is not only about public requests from citizens or journalists. It also matters inside government, where elected officials need equal information to deliberate, vote, and represent the public. And in Manitoba, LJ reporter Renee Lilly at the Portage Graphic Leader reports that the Portage Local Immigration Partnership, a new grassroots initiative, and the Portage Learning and Literacy Center are launching a newcomer advisory committee. The goal is to bring people with lived immigrant experience into the process of identifying service gaps. Program coordinator Malika Pruthi says newcomers face barriers including access to information, language, and navigating public systems. The committee plans to meet monthly and produce an annual report to help institutions and service providers improve. This includes calling on diverse cross-sections of the community, including international students, newly arrived refugees, long-term immigrants, and other community members to join the table to map out rapidly changing immigration trends. This is access in a practical sense. People cannot use public services effectively if information is inaccessible, assumptions replace consultation, or language barriers prevent informed decisions. Finally, in this section, the Canadian Press reports that Tesla is threatening legal action after Manitoba removed Tesla vehicles from its electric vehicle rebate program. A 2-page document says the company intends to ask a judge to set aside Tesla's exclusion from the rebate program as procedurally unfair and undertaken for an improper purpose. The Manitoba government ended rebates for Tesla vehicles and vehicles made in China in response to U.S. tariffs. A letter from Tesla's lawyers says the exclusion appears procedurally unfair and unrelated to the program's stated objectives. The NDP government launched the rebates in 2024 of up to $4,000 for people who buy electric vehicles worth up to $70,000. Last year, the government stopped the rebates for Tesla vehicles and vehicles made in China in retaliation for tariffs. Freedom of Information records show Tesla vehicles accounted for more than 20% of approved Manitoba rebates between August 2024 and February 2025, or 337 vehicles, worth just under $1.3 million. Here again, FOI supplies the factual baseline. It shows how much public money was involved before the policy changed, and gives the public a clearer way to assess whether the decision was principled, political, or both. Now to international stories. In the United States, the Associated Press reports that lawmakers and survivors are still searching for accountability in the Jeffrey Epstein case. Congress has pursued interviews, subpoenas, and legislation requiring the release of case files. Democratic Representative Ro Khanna of California, who sponsored legislation to force the release of case files on Epstein, told the Associated Press he is still asking why there has not been a single investigation of people who have been allegedly abused or committed financial crimes. Lawmakers hope to get some answers to those questions during a transcribed interview with Pam Bondi. But lawmakers say they still have few answers about government failures, accountability for powerful figures, and why more action has not followed. In a related Associated Press story report on that interview with former Attorney General Pam Bondi, she refused to answer lawmakers' questions about President Donald Trump's involvement in the release of Epstein case files. When questioned, Pam Bondi said she wasn't certain of the extent of his knowledge. For this podcast, the access and privacy issue is not the partisan fight. It is the deeper question of whether transparency can be delivered without re-traumatizing survivors or exposing sensitive personal information. Accountability requires records, but the release of records also requires care. In California, the Associated Press reports that the state attorney general has sued 23andMe, alleging the genetic testing company failed to protect sensitive user data in a 2023 breach affecting nearly 7 million people. The lawsuit alleges attackers used credential stuffing and that the company failed to take common protective steps, such as requiring password resets or multi-factor authentication after warning signs. The company said it only found out about the breach in October 2023 when the stolen data was posted for sale on the dark web. However, the lawsuit said the company failed to properly investigate red flags that appeared months earlier. Some stolen data reportedly included genetic data, health reports, information shared with relatives, and location and birth year data of relatives. Genetic data is uniquely sensitive because it can reveal information not only about one person, but about families and communities. That makes security failures especially serious. Also in the US, the Associated Press reports that a Google software engineer has been charged with using confidential search data to make more than $1.2 million on Polymarket. Prosecutors allege the employee used Google's unpublished year-end search data to place bets on prediction market contracts before the information became public. Google says the employee accessed marketing material through a tool available to employees, but that using confidential information for betting is a serious breach of policy. According to the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, this reinforces a decades-old message. Corporate insiders cannot use confidential business information to turn a profit in markets. Polymarket reiterated it has worked closely with authorities to identify the issue. The case shows how internal data, even data that may not look like traditional financial information, can become market moving when tied to prediction platforms. And in Malaysia, the Associated Press reports the government has begun enforcing rules barring children under 16 from having social media accounts. Platforms with at least 8 million users in Malaysia must implement age verification systems and block underage users from creating accounts. Users identified as under 16 will have a month to download or transfer data, including photos and videos, before restrictions or other actions are applied. The government says the goal is to protect children from harmful content, cyberbullying, and addictive platform features. But critics warn the rules could increase privacy risks if age verification requires government ID or causes platforms to store more sensitive personal information. Others warn the rules could push young people into less regulated spaces online. The international pattern is clear. Countries including Australia, Brazil, and Indonesia have introduced or announced age-based restrictions or requirements for children's access to social media. Governments are trying to protect people from digital harms, but without careful privacy design, new safety rules can create new surveillance and data protection risks. Before we go, 2 whistleblowing stories. The BC Securities Commission has paid out its first whistleblower award. The award was $25,000, and the Commission says the information contributed to an ongoing enforcement action involving suspected misconduct. The Commission says it gives whistleblower awards for information leading to specific types of enforcement action, including a halt trade order, preservation orders, and formal allegations. Details of the case are not being disclosed in order to protect the whistleblower's identity. The BC program is notable because awards can be paid while enforcement matters are ongoing, not only at the end of a hearing. Awards range from $1,000 to $500,000, depending on the value of the information. Commissioner Chair Brenda Leong says the payout shows that when people come forward, it can make a real difference in the Commission's ability to protect investors and market integrity. Whistleblower systems depend on trust. People need to know that reporting wrongdoing will be taken seriously and that their identity will be protected. And finally, Ontario's top court has restored parts of an agriculture law targeting undercover investigations on farms. The Security from Trespass and Protecting Food Safety Act makes it illegal to gain access to a farm under false pretenses, including to document conditions inside. Animal Justice, an activist, and a journalist challenged the law, arguing it limited charter-protected expression and interfered with efforts to expose animal mistreatment. A lower court struck down parts of the law in 2024. The province moved to appeal the decision, arguing the judge erred by concluding the law limited charter-protected expression by activists, journalists, and whistleblowers. But the Ontario Court of Appeal has now overturned that decision, finding that although exposés about farm animal treatment are high-value expression, the law's impairment is minimal compared with its benefits. Animal Justice says it is reviewing the decision and considering next steps, including seeking leave to appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada. The province says the point of the act was to protect farmers and their animals, strengthen biosecurity, and prevent economic harm. The case sits at the intersection of property rights, biosecurity, journalism, whistleblowing, and freedom of expression. It also raises a familiar accountability question. When information is hidden inside private spaces, what legal protections exist for people trying to bring matters of public interest to light? That's it for this week's Access and Privacy Online News Summary. As always, we hope today's stories help you stay informed about the latest issues in privacy, information management, access to information, and public transparency. To help us keep the mics on, please subscribe through FIPA News Monitoring, share the show, or consider making a donation to support FIPA's work. Our writer is Sean Fisk. Original music for today's show was composed by the mysterious Breakmaster Cylinder. I'm Patrick Farnsworth, your host and producer. A big FIPA thank you to all the reporters, outlets, contributors, and listeners who make this podcast possible. Thank you for joining us. Stay safe and stay informed.